It is my pleasure to now present Dr. Arun Singh in conversation with Dr. V Somanathan on the possible roadmap to economic recovery and stimulus packages amid the current economic headwinds. Looking forward to an insightful session with you, sirs. Over to you, please.
Thank you and welcome, Dr. Somanathan ji. And we heard you, and it was really very insightful story you presented. And you know, sir, you're right that this is very unprecedented time, and we all know that this happened almost a century after the first things we experienced in the 1918. Since then, economy, there was basically many changes happened in India and in other economy. Some of the economy deteriorated, some of the economy become a global giant, and that's is basically leading the story from the front. Now, taking that conversation forward and just to understand your perspective that where we are headed as an economy and what we can expect from the economy, what we can expect from the government to ensure that we come out of this pandemic and come out of this pandemic as soon as possible, maybe the sooner, maybe the next month or this year itself, and healthy and resilient. Now we know that there is a significant change happening in the global landscape. We all are all over to leverage that to capitalize on that. Given in that context, I have a few questions, and I thought I'll ask you with the most prominent question, which everyone having in their mind, is about the GDP growth and what basically we are expecting from that. So you know that this is the first time it happened that GDP is likely to be contracted by, I mean, first time in a decade. How do you foresee the economic recovery for India from the current pandemic?
First, see, I like to be optimistic. So I'm not sure that we'll actually contract this year, though that's very much a possibility. It's also a possibility that we might be at 0% growth or even marginally positive if the last 2 quarters of this year are very positive. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed. I haven't yet come to the conclusion that it will be negative growth, but that's very much a possibility. I agree with you. Of course, this is a one-time event. Remember that, but in the months of January and February, we were actually seeing an incipient re-ignition of growth, and things were beginning to pick up in terms of the structural problems that we faced between 2017 and 19. We were actually seeing a pickup in the first quarter of this calendar year. Then, of course, it was all swept away by the pandemic. So I foresee that, yes, this year might be somewhere near zero, plus or minus a couple of percentage points is where we would be in terms of economic growth. I think it's a year that, for all practical purposes, is a non-growth year, or if you like, it's like a gap between 2 points with a V in between. But I do foresee that it's a V and not a U, and I'm very confident that once the pandemic begins to abate, and that's the key condition. It's not, in my view, it's not what the government does, it's much more what the virus does that will determine how soon we get out of this. But assuming that we are close to the worst of it, then 2021-22 should see a fairly rapid recovery. And I think the conditions are in place to make that a sustainable recovery that will then continue beyond 2021-22 into the foreseeable future. So I'm actually quite optimistic, because I think a lot of the problems that we're seeing are pandemic related, and in fact the structural parts of the economy are actually improving. So I think we will actually emerge stronger. There will be some casualties on the way, but I think overall we will be leaner and fitter when we get out of this.
Thank you, sir. I think, sir, there is a reason for that optimistic, and I'm hoping the same way. Just to add your piece when we're talking about the green shoot. To be very honest, sir, we do the business optimism index at DNB, and we are doing for last 17 years. We reach out to some 500 companies in India, and we basically ask them how you see. To be very honest, sir, in month of January to 2020, when we released that that index was almost 6 year high, and the business optimism index is a leading indicator, and that leading indicator explains 83% correlation coefficient with the GDP growth rate, which means that corroborate to your assessment, sir, that in start of this year 2020 actually green shoots were visible. Unfortunate event happened with the COVID, that things collapse, and I'm optimistic too that things will be better off as soon as possible. Now with that, I'm trying to and you touch base a lot on this one, uh, trying to be a very specific stuff going forward in the future about your economic revival package. I mean, do you see more scope for further stimulus package for economic revival? And what are your views on the fiscal consolidation path of the central government and state government? By when, will we be back on track?
Yeah, I think that's a very it's a good question, and which means you may not get a good answer. But it's see, I think your first question was, is there more scope for further stimulus packages to stimulate economic revival? So in principle, the answer is of course yes. I mean, nothing is ever ruled out. Um, but I think I'd like to take a cricketing analogy here. I think there is a very important element of how we time this. I mean, if you time a shot very well, it goes to the boundary. If you mistime it, you get caught behind. So I think the key point for us is what is the right time at which further measures are appropriate, and then of course there's a question of what those measures are. Right now, the evidence is that the problem is not susceptible of stimulation by fiscal or government measures, because it's not as if people are waiting for something to be done by the government and then they're ready to go out and resume normal economic activity. Normal economic activity is in abeyance, not because of something the government has done or has not done, but because people are still scared for their health, and because the health situation remains in many parts of the country very vulnerable. So long as the services sector outside of finance and insurance is virtually shut down, I mean, financial services sector is okay, but many of the personal services are at an all-time low. So, I mean, cinemas are closed, restaurants are technically open but not serving many customers, malls have very few footfalls. So these are things that I don't think a fiscal stimulus or a diktat from the government can actually make people re-enter these spheres of activity. So the revival will really come when the psychology of the pandemic begins to ebb. And that is, I think, something that will come when it comes. I mean, I have no better prediction of it than anyone else, but I'm sure it will come. And I think it's not very far away. So at that time, it may be, that the government can help it along a little bit with a few measures here and there. You also mentioned fiscal consolidation. So whatever we do, we also have to keep an eye on fiscal prudence and looking at what is sustainable in the long run. So we have a short run where we can, of course, I mean, as you know, we have certainly gone beyond original budget estimates in a huge way. I mean, much more than people actually think, because the government's budget deficit is actually the difference between two numbers. A lot of people are focused on the expenditure number, and many people would like to see that much higher, of course. But not many people are looking at the receipts number, which has actually also fallen drastically. So the deficit is expanding not just because of expenditure packages, it's also expanding because revenues are falling. So we are quite prepared for that. This is a special year, and we're not going to stick to arbitrary fiscal targets that were fixed in a different era. So, I mean, we have bid goodbye to those targets. Nevertheless, we do want to be fiscally prudent. We want India to be on a sustainable long-term growth path, which means that the government needs to have a healthy set of finances. So in terms of fiscal consolidation for the future, this is not the year when we are looking at consolidation. Obviously, we are overspending relative to past targets. But from 2021-22, I foresee two things happening. One, revenues will probably pick up substantially in the next financial year. That will create the ability for us to consolidate. And second, I think a lot of the special expenditures that have been incurred for the pandemic will not arise next year. And thirdly, I think if we can actually get the growth rate up, then we will actually see both revenue buoyancy and a greater sustainability of our debt. We are also encouraging the state governments to make have been allowed to do this year is partly tied to sustainability conditions that require them to improve their future revenue collections. So I think we are conscious of the need for fiscal consolidation and we have a plan. It's all a matter of timing and which part is executed when.
So you rightly mentioned couple of points, and I could not agree you more than this, that we need to come out of this fear factor for the COVID-19 to ensure that economic activities are resumed. My own experience in last 20-25 days suggests that, I mean, if you take away that fear part and you change the psychology, what's happening today, I think economy is going to back. And we have seen the recovery rate, which is 76% as of today. And I think there's a need to convey that positive message across all over in India and abroad, that I think we are doing far better. Now this is a time to go back to economic activity and kickstart the economic activity. And that's, I agree with you. And sir, you mentioned about the fiscal consolidation. I do remember 2009, after the financial crisis, when things deteriorated, fiscal deficit was really challenging that time, and government opted for fiscal consolidation package, and they basically went ahead the expenditure. And as a result of that, we were the some of the few countries who emerged from the financial crisis, as compared to the other economy. And you're right in doing that. So you mentioned about the receipt, and that's a true, because this is very challenging time, sir. In that context, I have a third question uh, today, that expenditure could be higher than usual, whereas revenue could be lesser than usual. In that scope, you think there could be a rationalization of expenditure? Because you mentioned that you don't want to do that, but is there any scope to cut the expenditure, unwanted expenditure, or you just continue with the same flow what was in the 2019 and what was basically planned for 2020?
No, we actually are very actively engaged in seeking to rationalize expenditure without necessarily reducing it. I mean, there will definitely be an increase, but we hope to moderate the increase by reprioritizing what we spend on. So we have some kinds of expenditure that have a much higher multiplier effect on the economy. Those kinds of expenditure we seek to not only protect, but if possible, enhance. So you may have seen in the first quarter of this financial year, despite all the financial pressures that we faced, there was actually a big uptick in capital expenditure, which is on roads and rail and other kinds of capital expenditure, because they have high multiplier effects for the economy. So we're actually looking at our expenditure profile, prioritizing things that have high multipliers, and de-emphasizing things that are perhaps not a high priority and don't have high positive effects on the economy. So that exercise is ongoing, and we are doing a considerable amount of reprioritization in order to minimize the fiscal impact of the expenditure increases that we are doing in order to tackle the pandemic.
Thank you, sir. I think that was great, because that's very critical, very important, to put a money where you get a more return than to put a money where you get a less return. And that's basically dilemma government face during this time of crisis period. And basically, when you talk about, sir, investment, we talk about private investment. The unfortunately, what has happened, when we're talking about the green shoot in the first quarter of this year, last few years, we have seen there is some concern related to the private investment, and then government basically have to go ahead with the capital expenditure to put money into ensure that the money multiplier, investment multiplier is higher to ensure attract private investment. In that context, I have the fourth question is that I think government have taken a huge measures to to ease the supply side constraint and to get credit. What intervention are required on the demand side, or the in fact on the other word that how can the optimism level of the businesses be raised to kickstart the investment cycle, which is the need of the hour, because unless the investment cycle kicks off, demand cycle will not be revived.
Yeah, a good point. First, one thing that I want to make clear is that some of the credit measures that the government, through its guarantees, and the Reserve Bank, through its various credit facilities, have announced, are not necessarily supply side measures. So, if you look at, with interest rates falling, and with the Reserve Bank actually changing the benchmarking system for interest rates so that it's much more closely correlated with the repo rate than it used to be, you actually have a big drop in consumer loan interest rates, whether it's for housing, whether it's for consumer durables, or for other items of consumption. So there is a demand element which kicks in through the credit measures, because credit is cheaper. Its interest rates have come down by maybe 2% over the last year on many kinds of loans, and that is quite significant. Uh, so, we gave money to 200 million Dhan accounts. We have statistics that show that about 40% of it has been saved and not spent. So the point I'm making here is not that people don't need support, but that there are limitations to how much you can create demand through fiscal stimuli, because fiscal stimuli can also be saved. And so the key for me, I come back to something I said earlier. The timing of the stimulus is critical. It needs to come at a time when people have shed the extreme fear that we saw maybe a couple of months ago. Then perhaps the government's measures will have a greater response from the people who need to stimulate the economy. And when we see that consumer response, I think we will see the investment response follow. But right now, all that we can do, and which we are doing, is to basically make a lot of structural corrections to the way the economy functions, so that businesses can see that when this gets fixed, you're actually going to operate in a better structure than you did before. So the hope is that we wait. I mean, in one sense, we are being passive. We're waiting for the health issue to begin to abate, because frankly, that's not very susceptible to our, tools and our responses. In a sense, at least in the finance ministry, there's nothing I can do about it. We just have to wait for it. And then when it abates, we can look at what more we can do to stimulate optimism. And in the meanwhile, we're trying to make structural changes that will help businesses do better when the demand begins to materialize, hopefully later this
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Somanathan. That was really insightful, and you're right in saying that. I mean, you mentioned about the fear factor. I think that's a need to reflect on the economy, and I must say that in last 1 or 2 month experience, I think it's unlock three is far better in terms of the economic activity on the ground than other one. And in fact, economic activity started. What we need is that basically that optimism returning to the economic activity by eliminating that fear factor. And so I'm also optimistic, and I'm hoping that economy will come back to its own what it used to be the last quarter of 2020 2019, and I'm hoping for that. And one thing I must acknowledge, the fact that the first time I have seen that prompt, the action taken by the government is so prompt that right from the March when we started to feel that impact of COVID-19, government have taken several measures, and that really today From a 20% of the workforce resumed office in April, today now 70% of the workforce have resumed the office, and that's basically great. And we are hoping for the good from the economic recovery perspective. With that, I would like to say thank you for your insightful answer. Thank you, sir.